We are moving into the second half of our course this morning, so this is the beginning of part 3 of the course, where we're going to be covering intelligence, development, emotion, stress, and health, and personality. Before we get into the beginning of the new material, I do want to take a few minutes here to review some of the items from Test 2 that caused some problems. I do want to note the significant improvement that you guys had from Test 1 to Test 2. The class average went up to a 73 from a 66 on Test 1. So that's good. Seems like you guys are getting a better sense of the kinds of questions you're going to see. Your preparation probably was even better for Test 2 than it was for Test 1. So if we can maintain that kind of upward momentum, we're going to be in good shape overall. I do want to review the items that cause the most headache. So again, as we go through these, if you got any of these wrong, you are certainly not alone. So let's just review the ones that seem to cause the most problems from test number 2. Oh, before I even get into that, just in case you're curious, the correlation of test 1 scores with test 2 scores looks something like this. So it's a positive 0.60. That is, people who did worse on test 1 tended to do worse on test 2. Those in general who did better on test 2 tended to do better on test 1 as well. So we see a pretty decent, moderate-sized correlation there. Let's look at the difficult items. Miriam steps out of a store and glances at her car parked across the street. A bus passes by, momentarily blocking her view of her car. She sees the bus as closer than her car due to what? What do you guys think? Chime into the chat box. What is that one from these different depth cues? Is it relative size, linear perspective, texture gradient, or interposition? See a lot of people saying interposition, right? This was the one that we said was also known as occlusion, where something blocks out something else. The correct answer, yes, there was D. So good job with that for those of you who chimed in there. About 60% of you guys got that one right. This one, I'm not going to read this giant long question, but basically this is a levels of processing question, right? If you look right here, it says, according to the levels of processing framework, which group is going to perform the best? Well, it should be something about the meaning for you to do the best, and it should be something relatively shallow or superficial for you to do the worst. As you look at the list there, which of those, A, B, C, or D, seems to best summarize what we know about levels of processing? Where are you going to do best? I see a number of people saying A, and you guys are right, right? It's going to be the best performance by those who were asked to write down a synonym or an antonym for the word, because to do that you have to think of the meaning, versus those who were asked whether it has the same letter as some other target word. So that was directly from the demonstration that we did last week on Tuesday in our online session where we finished up the section on memory. A little more than half of you guys got that right, again around 60%. This next one, which consequences correctly match with an example? I love this one. So let's look at these together. A, positive reinforcement. Harvey is suspended when he vandalizes school property. Is that correct? No. Why is it not correct? Because the example is clearly not reinforcement. What is it? That's punishment. Okay, so it's not A. Let's take a look at B. Jeff puts his umbrella up when it starts to sprinkle so he won't get wet. Does that look like a correct combination there? I do this behavior and it helps me avoid getting wet. That looks pretty good. Let's just make sure the other ones are also wrong, right? Takes away the getting wet. Positive punishment. Jacqueline's teacher puts a cute sticker on an arithmetic exercise completed without mistakes. That's not punishment. What's that? That's positive reinforcement. Okay, and then D, is this wrong? Tommy receives a written reprimand from his boss following a series of customer complaints. Well, the boss gives him this reprimand, this letter, this note, right? So it's punishment, but what kind of punishment is that? When he presents him with that note. It's positive punishment. So you guys are right. The correct way to go with this one was to say, yeah, this is in choice B here, a good example of negative reinforcement. I do this to avoid getting wet. That's exactly right. Any questions on that at all? That's a pretty challenging question because you got to think a lot about all 4 options there, right? And that's not one that you can just kind of blast right through. All right, next up. Advertisers use enjoyable music, cute babies, attractive models, funny spokespeople to create positive advertisements. The music, babies, attractive models are all best thought of as what? What are those? What is your reaction supposed to be, especially if you're a guy, I guess, watching one of the Carl's Jr. ads, right, where they're eating these gigantic hamburgers in these salacious ways, aren't they? Those are supposed to be US's, right? Enjoyable music, everybody looks like they're having fun. Those are all US's, right? Those are things that should naturally cause a positive reaction, like a cute baby. If I pair that together with this new shampoo, let's say, now you're going to associate the positive reactions to the cute baby, hopefully, to that shampoo as well. That was the most difficult item on the test. Only about 1 in 4 of you guys got that one right. Does that make sense now? If you've got it, tell them in the chat box. Do you understand why that would be a series of US's? Things that would automatically lead to some kind of positive emotional reaction. So again, the correct choice was D there. All right, moving on. Taxis on the street produce a small retinal image for somebody who's on the 90th floor. You don't think they're tiny little taxis. What is that all about? Size blank. Yeah, that's got to be size constancy, right? That's the example, like flying out of San Diego over Ocean Beach. About half of you had that one correct. We'll keep rolling on here. Esther dreams she's flying. The psychoanalyst suggests that such a dream represents a hidden desire for sexual intercourse. Okay, fantastic. What statement is true here? Well, we distinguish between manifest content and latent content. So it's something about that. Which one is which here? Is flying the latent content or is flying the manifest content? What do you guys think? Yeah, flying is the manifest content. That's the story, right? That's the narrative that was part of the dream. And then we're going to interpret that manifest content to hopefully identify the underlying hidden or latent content. About 56% of you got that one right. Number 35, how is smell different from these other senses? I mentioned this more than once. Everything other than smell goes through the what? Goes through the thalamus, the relay center for sensory information. A little less than half of you had that one correct. And then I guess that was the last one I had lined up for you. I thought I had one more, but I don't. Any questions on any of those items or any other feedback regarding test number 2 before we turn the page there? Too easy, too hard, just right, fair, unfair, best test ever, worst test ever, loved it, hated it. Fair is good. Okay, we'll take just right. So we're about to move into, thanks guys, to the section on intelligence. I want to just give you the heads up. This is the sprint part of the course. Because of the way the calendar lays out for us in November, with no class on Tuesday the 11th because of Veterans Day, and then no class obviously on Thanksgiving Day, we lose some time in the final part of the course in part 4. That means part 3's got to run a little bit more quickly. And so basically what we have here is 5 days of instruction during which we cover 4 chapters. That's as fast as I ever go. It basically means we're pretty much covering 1 content area per day. We're going to do intelligence almost completely this morning. We'll probably have a little bit to finish up face-to-face on Thursday. On Thursday, we'll start development. Next Tuesday online, we'll finish development. Then Thursday the 30th, we'll have a 1-day, 1-session face-to-face class about emotion, stress, and health. And then the final class session will actually be an online session on Tuesday the 4th on personality, where we again do 1 chapter during 1 class session. I'm going to tell you more about that personality section on Thursday, but basically what's going to happen is there's going to be a recording available to you guys of the personality section, because I'm going to be out of town on Tuesday the 4th and won't be able to do a live session. So I'm going to use a previous recording to cover that content with you guys. So if it feels like I'm going a little bit more quickly through part 3 of the course here, I am. Because it's the only way for us to get to where we want to get to as we move through both parts 3 and part 4 of our course. So today we're going to talk about intelligence and intelligence assessment. And the way I would break this down for you in terms of an organizer for your notes and your thinking about this is we're going to begin this morning by talking about assessment in general. Then we're specifically going to get into the details regarding intelligence testing, or what I'm going to call IQ testing. IQ stands for intelligence quotient, as we'll learn in just a bit, and actually historically was originally an actual quotient where something was being divided by something else. We'll talk about that in a bit. By the time we're done this morning, we will certainly dip our toe into the nature versus nurture issue, in this case with respect to intelligence. And that becomes a pretty significant theme here in the second part of our course, where we talk about nature versus nurture here. We talk about it again when we talk about language development. That will be next Tuesday online. In the personality lecture, you're going to see certainly coverage about the degree to which personality is driven by nature, genetics, versus nurture or environment. And then we come back to nature versus nurture one final time in the section on the psychological disorders, when we talk about, well, what causes these things, right? What makes people have these kinds of problems? Is it genetics and biology? Is it environment? What's causing this stuff? So that's a major theme in the second part of the course for sure. So let's begin by talking about the more generic ideas related to this concept of assessment, what we mean by assessment, and then we'll zoom in and talk about intelligence assessment per se. So when we talk about assessment, what we're talking about is what's defined here with this second little bullet point. The use of specified procedures to evaluate people's abilities, behaviors, and personal qualities. So let's think about that for a second, right? Specified procedures is a phrase that I think is an important one in this definition. Why am I saying that? Well, because as we're going to talk about this morning, when we look at abilities that you have, like intelligence, we're going to have some very specific items on some very specific tests that have to be administered in very specific ways. Okay, so this makes psychological assessment different from the everyday sort of layperson's mini psychological assessments that you might do on an everyday basis. What do I mean? Well, on an everyday basis, you're really evaluating other people in lots of different situations, right? If you have a class where there's a student who on one day of class is asking a lot of questions, you might be evaluating them and assessing them and thinking about, well, why are they doing that? Okay, are they really particularly engaged with this content and really interested in what we're learning about? Or are they just trying to make themselves look good to the professor? What's that all about? Okay, what we're going to see here is there are going to be some pretty strict rules when we follow the specified procedures that are part of formal psychological assessment. And again, it makes it really different from the sort of everyday judgments and sometimes even snap judgments that we make about other people, right? You might see someone walking through the mall. You might see someone walking through the library, somebody walking across campus here at SDSU, and you make some kind of assessment about their abilities, about their behaviors, about what they're like, right? You can make many assessments of personal qualities. Well, when we get into the section on personality, we're going to talk about more formal ways. So maybe that's the way to think about specified procedures, is that they represent more than anything formal ways of getting at the kinds of things that we're talking about down below here, right? Your intelligence, your personality, your behaviors. It goes beyond just kind of like, well, she seems kind of nice. She seemed pretty friendly. She was relatively outgoing. What you're really doing there when you describe somebody like that after having met them is you're describing their personality, but you're not doing it in this formal way. Okay. Today, when we talk about intelligence assessment, you're going to see it's very formal, it's very rigorous, and in some ways you could say it's pretty rigid. Right? There are certain things that you have to do. There are certain questions that you have to ask in a specific order, and the administration of the test, as we're going to talk about, has to be standardized. Okay? So that's a way to distinguish between what we're going to talk about here in intelligence testing and continue talking about in terms of personality assessment, and then even formal diagnostic assessments when we get into talking about things like OCD or depression or panic disorder or things like that. Okay? So I want to distinguish that from, again, these everyday sorts of impressions that you might have of other people. One of the most important slides we're going to do today is this one, where we sort of spell out what are these specified procedures really aiming at? What are the major considerations when you go to these more formal procedures for assessing things like intelligence? Well, there are three things that we've got to know something about for this part of the course when we talk about intelligence and intelligence assessment. Number one, we have to revisit reliability. Number two, we get to revisit validity. So the good news is the first two are things that we already talked about back in part one of the course when we discussed research methods. And then finally, standardization. I alluded to this before. I'll spell that out in just a couple minutes here in terms of the administration of these tests where we do follow these standard kinds of procedures. So let's pretend for a second that we're going to develop a new intelligence test today. You and I together, this group that we have here, 22 people plus me, we're going to sit down and develop, well, we're going to call it the LeMakis IQ test because I want to make all the money from it. And we need to, first of all, focus on reliability in constructing this test. What does that mean? Well, as it says here, in a word, reliability is about consistency, right? Can we demonstrate, for example, that this new LeMakis IQ test has what's called test-retest reliability? Does anybody remember that from our discussion earlier on in the course? Who wants to try to chime in and remind me what test-retest reliability means? If I have a consistent measure, this IQ test that we develop, and it has good test-retest reliability, what does that mean? Is anybody going to be brave enough to say something? If you think you've got something, I invite you to chime into the chat box, but don't all do it at once because it gets to be kind of overwhelming. Marina says a similar outcome each time. Carol says when you keep retesting, you're going to get the same or very similar results. That's exactly what we're going after here. So basically the idea is something like this, right? If we were to draw out something like this, right? Your scores at time 1, so let me just label the axes here. Here are your scores at time 1 on the new LeMakis IQ test. Here are the scores at time 2. What kind of slope do we expect to get in the scatter plot? Tell me in the chat box. What kind of correlation coefficient are we going to get? Positive or negative? Close to 1, close to 0? What do you guys think? If it has good test-retest reliability. Should be close to positive 1, right? We should get a scatter plot even closer, I guess is the word I'm trying to find, to 1 than what we saw with our test 1, test 2 correlations, right? So we should get something that looks like this, right? Where the folks who score higher at time 1 tend to score higher at time 2 as well. And this person down here who scored pretty low at time 1 also scores pretty low at time 2. It turns out, guys, that for the good, reliable intelligence tests that we're going to be looking at today, we're going to talk about the test called the Wechsler test. These tests have test-retest correlation coefficients of positive 0.90 and higher. That's what positive 0.90 plus means, right? So very consistent results. That means these are tests where if you took them today on October 21st and came back and took them again in a month on November 21st, your scores would be really, really similar. You had a 108 today, you'd probably get right around a 108 a month from now, okay? Reliability matters. But as we talked about in the methods section, that's not enough, right? We mentioned the bathroom scale that would reliably say that Dr. LeMakis' weight is 100 pounds. And you guys kind of chuckled a little bit because you knew that that was probably not right. And the reason it wasn't right is it wasn't valid, right? Validity has to do with how well my measure measures the variable that it's trying to measure. right? And there are all kinds of validity, right? There is something called predictive validity. We hope, for example, that the SAT test has predictive validity for who will be able to succeed and graduate from college versus who will not, okay? So if I'm going to develop a valid test of intelligence, I probably need to cast the net pretty widely. And I think validity, more than anything, is where online IQ tests come up short. Okay. How many of you guys have ever tried one of the online IQ tests that you can Google and poke around and check out? Have any of you guys ever done that? I've done it. Have you ever noticed anything about the kinds of items that are on those IQ tests and how that might relate to validity? Well, one of the things you might notice is that lots of the items, they're actually pretty similar. Questions about vocabulary, or lots of mathematical questions, or a lot of nonverbal reasoning questions. Well, to get a good, valid IQ test, like we're going to try to develop today, right, this new Lamecus IQ test, we probably are going to need to sample from a huge, broad range of capacities, right? We don't just want to look at vocabulary. We don't just want to look at arithmetic skills. But tell me in the chat box, what other sorts of things should be brought in and should be made part of the questions that we're going to put into this IQ test? In other words, what else should we be asking people to do? Let's see what we come up with. What other kinds of subtests might you put together in one of these IQ tests? Something about comprehension, I like that. Reasoning, right? Solving a puzzle. So we're going beyond math, we're going beyond vocabulary. And that's really what I want you guys to think about. You're right, the importance of being able to assess widely the person's functioning in a number of different domains. Okay? Any questions about validity or reliability? These first two important considerations in our psychological assessment. Make sense? Let's talk about the final piece here, standardization. Basically, the story here with standardization is we have to follow uniform testing procedures, which basically means we need to do the same thing with every single person to whom we administer a given test. So if we develop this new Lamecus IQ test today, that's great. Okay, but we're going to need to definitely be very careful in the sequencing of the items, the sequencing of the subtest, how long we give people to complete different tests, and all of those sorts of things. So with the tests we're going to look at, again, the Wechsler tests that are very widely used IQ tests, there's a whole manual that basically spells out what you as the test administrator are supposed to do. Right? Very specific rules and policies and procedures. And the reason why, guys, this is so important is it's because when we're done with your individual testing, we're going to compare your scores to a bunch of what we call same-age peers. This is going to be a key little phrase today. Same-age peers. In other words, I bet that I have mostly a bunch of 18-year-olds here with me this morning doing this online session. When I get done administering this new Lamecus IQ test to you guys, I'm going to need to compare your performance to thousands of other 18-year-olds who are part of what's called the standardization sample for our test. So in other words, I administer the test using these uniform testing procedures to thousands of other 18-year-olds. And then when you do what you do on the test, I basically compare you to the people who are your age. Okay? Or if I had a bunch of 70-year-old people taking the test today, I'm going to compare the 70-year-olds' performance to that of other 70-year-olds. I don't want to compare 70-year-olds to 18-year-olds. Okay, because on some of these subtests, right, like reasoning or maybe solving a puzzle or some kind of speed of processing task, 70-year-olds, if they're compared to 18-year-olds, are going to look like they're not doing particularly well. So what do? We compare you to same-age peers. But in order to be able to make those comparisons useful and really valid, right, truthful comparisons, I have to treat everybody exactly the same way. So here's where the rigidity and the formality of this intelligence testing comes into play, right? This is how psychological assessment is different from like, oh, he's a pretty smart guy, right? We had dinner, he seemed like he knew a lot about a lot of different things, he was well-spoken, he was thoughtful, etc. Okay, that's informal. Now when we do formal psychological assessment, we've got to follow these rigid procedures in order to be able to be sure on the back end that we have a useful measure and a useful way to quantify this slippery thing, this unobservable thing called intelligence. Okay? Any questions on any of these three big considerations? I guarantee you that that's already a couple of questions on test number 3. Reliability, validity, and standardization. Key ideas as we get it rolling here. Make sense? Okay, let me do this. Let me see what I can do with the polling here and give you an ABCD poll with this question here. How about this one? A teacher grades by giving men C's and women A's. The men don't like that, the women do. This method of grading is reliable, valid, both, or neither. Think about it and choose A, B, C, or D. I'll give you guys a minute or so to figure that one out. Again, the choice is up above the list of participants. You roll over the little A, and then you can choose A, B, C, or D right there. Let's take another 15 seconds on this one. All right, 5 more seconds. This is going to be an interesting one to talk about. All right, let me toss the responses here. For those of us who responded, there was a pretty even split, 11-7 between it's reliable A or D. It's neither reliable nor valid. Let's talk about it for a second. For those of you who chose A and said this is reliable, why is it reliable? Why is this a reliable way of grading? The men get C's and the women get A's. What makes this reliable? It's going to happen every time. You can predict the grade. It's a consistent measure. Okay? All right. How about the folks who chose D? If you thought it was neither reliable nor valid, what was your thinking there? What made you think it was not either of those things? Because it sounds like now the controversy is about whether it's reliable or not. Because almost no one chose B, saying it's valid. If you didn't think it was reliable or valid, why did you think it was neither of those things? No matter what they do, they will receive the same grade. Okay? I would agree with that. But doesn't that mean then that you would think it's reliable? They're graded inconsistently. How so? How is there inconsistent grading here? Because that's the opposite of what everybody who chose A said. I'm putting you on the spot, I know, sorry. I guess the question is, Joan, from a test-retest perspective, if we gave this test again in a week, would we get consistent results for the men, for the women, for individuals on a test-to-test basis? The test today, the test again in a week. Would they get the same results each time? What kind of test-retest correlation coefficient would we get? If they followed these procedures, yeah, they would. What would be our test-retest correlation coefficient? If the men always get C's and the women always get A's. Let's do this. Let me clear the responses, and why don't you guys answer it again? So let me bounce to my next slide, because I knew this was going to be a challenging one. I actually had to load it in here twice. So choose A, B, C, or D again for this one. Reliable, valid, both, or neither. Let's take 10 more seconds. All right, cool. Let me toss the results out. Looks like we were pretty convincing in arguing that this is a reliable approach, right? It's going to yield consistent results. It's clearly not valid. Why is it not valid? Are the grades truthfully measuring what you know about say physics or calculus or history or whatever, they don't reflect an actual score. I would say they don't reflect an actual understanding of whatever the test is about, right? They're not truthfully getting at your mastery of that content. What is the test really telling you? I mean, if you looked at the list of grades, you wouldn't be able to tell who knew something well or not. What would you be able to tell? Looking into the grade book, you see a bunch of C's, you see a bunch of A's. You basically be able, as Caitlin's saying, right, you could be able to tell who's male and who's female, right, or the gender, as Marina's saying. Exactly. Good. Any questions on that at all? So the idea of reliability, it's consistent. All right, let's turn our attention to the history of IQ testing before we zoom into a consideration of contemporary approaches to measuring intelligence, and basically modern-day IQ tests. Well, the original IQ tests were put together by a man named Alfred Binet. So this is Binet right here. I'll give you his first name just so you have it. Alfred is his first name. So Alfred Binet, as it says on the side here, was put in charge of developing a test to distinguish between what today would be called developmentally disabled kids and quote-unquote normal kids, right? Basically a screening tool. Could you help us identify the kids who might need some additional help academically in the Parisian school system? So he's working in Paris. He's put in charge of using this approach to assessment to basically screen out. We see some of the original items down below here. This represents the first workable intelligence test developed in 1905. So what's fascinating to me is if you think back prior to 1905 and you're like, hey, you know, what was George Washington's IQ? Or I heard Thomas Jefferson was pretty smart. Or how about Abraham Lincoln? We don't know what any of their IQs were because there was no intelligence testing prior to 1905. What Binet uses at the beginning, and is no longer used, was the concept of mental age to help develop something called the intelligence quotient score, or the IQ score. And here is the idea. Mental age was a construct or a variable. It's kind of a hypothetical thing that you possess, okay, that we could try to extract from you by giving you, let's say, for example, a series of increasingly difficult math items, or a series of increasingly difficult vocabulary words, okay? And let's say we went with the vocabulary example, and we lined up the words, you know, starting from block all the way through parsimonious, okay? And we expect kids of different ages to progress through this list of, let's say, 50 words to a certain point, right? 6-year-olds typically get to, let's say, word number 8. And 10-year-olds typically get to word number 18. And 15-year-olds typically get to word number 30. I'm just making up numbers, okay? That's the idea of mental age. It's basically how far through that sequence were you able to get in terms of this mental age construct. So we might say, with respect to vocabulary, you're 10 years old, but you are performing with the mental age of somebody who's 15. Okay? That is, you're doing better than we would expect you to. Given that you're 10, you're actually more like a 15-year-old in terms of vocabulary. You've got a pretty darn advanced vocabulary. Well, Binet then uses his mental age construct to compute this intelligence quotient, your IQ score. And basically what you do is you take your mental age, you divide it by your chronological age. So this is not Massachusetts and California. This is mental age over chronological age. That's a division problem. What do you get from a division problem? The answer is called a quotient. That's why we have intelligence quotient. And then to get rid of decimal points, what Binet does is he multiplies the resulting quotient by 100. Okay, so if you want this written a slightly different way, we could do mental age over chronological age. Let me grab my other tool here to draw a line between those two, right? We take that and then we multiply it by what? We multiply it by 100. Okay, there's your formula for intelligence quotient. Okay, that's how IQ was originally computed. We don't do it this way anymore because it turns out that there's a problem with this approach. The problem with this approach is with respect to this mental age construct. Think about it for a second. If your chronological age keeps going up, and you're 20, and then you're 30, and then you're 40, and then you're 50, but we don't have an increasingly difficult set of, let's say, vocabulary items to go hand in hand with that chronological age progression, what is it going to look like is happening with your IQ as you get older? If chronological age keeps going up, but mental age doesn't keep going up with it, if mental age, sort of starts to get stuck around 20 or 25, but now you're 30 and 35 and 40 and 45 and 50, the resulting, thank you, Catherine, right? The resulting IQ goes down, or as Marina says, it gets lower, right? So it looks like, based on this old way of computing IQ, again, we don't do it this way anymore, you could potentially look like you're getting dumber as you get older, okay? Why? Because we don't have a way to really quantify in a neat, tight, reliable way this mental age construct, and it's probably best brought home with this little comic here. That's my boy Mark. He's 39, but he's already reading at a 42-year-old level. Why is that funny? Because what the hell is the difference between the reading level of a 42-year-old versus a 39-year-old? Okay? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, we could roll it back in time and say, yeah, we would expect a 9-year-old to be reading at a different level than a 6-year-old, right? So that's where mental age starts to, or still makes sense. But it turns out that mental age starts to break down once we get past about age 16 or so. It's hard to conduct a test where we have increasingly difficult items that map neatly onto chronological age. So basically, the take-home message is we have abandoned this approach to computing intelligence scores on an IQ test. And we've instead gone in the direction of what we talked about earlier, which is comparing you and your performance to a bunch of what we call same age peers. So the alternative is to compare you to these same age peers. I meant to say peers with an S there. Okay? That's the way we do it now. We've abandoned this old way that Binet originally put together because, again, there are problems, and pretty significant ones, with this mental age idea. Okay, let me stop there for a second. Any questions or confusion about Binet's original stab at doing this? By the way, when you look at the testing materials over here, a whole bunch of different stuff, right? This is not just vocabulary, it's not just mathematics. There's some pretty engaging materials. And the Binet test, ultimately over time, is modified by a man named Louis Terman, who's up at Stanford, and becomes the Stanford Binet IQ test. Okay, we're not going to talk about that one. We're going to talk about the Wechsler test in just a bit. Let me make one final point here about this computation, Binet's original way of doing things. Mental age over chronological age times 100. Let's see how your math is this morning. If your mental age is the same as your chronological age, that is, you're 15 chronologically, that's your age down the bottom, and your mental age turns out to be 15, what's your IQ score always if mental age equals chronological age? Great, it's going to be 100, because that's going to be 1 times 100. What if your mental age is less than your chronological age? What do we know about your IQ score? If your mental age ends up being smaller than your chronological age, then your resulting IQ score is going to be less than 100, and now you know I'm going to ask if mental age is greater than chronological age, then the resulting IQ score is going to be what? It's going to be something greater than 100. Okay? Let's see if you guys can do this without any tears here. Give you a quick computation. If Marcy's mental age is 10 and her chronological age is 8, what's her IQ? A, B, C, or D here. So plug the numbers into the formula. I love giving one test item on this old school computation of IQ, just so you show that you understand what the formula says and this idea of mental age and chronological age and how they relate. So take a shot at this one. You're going to take those numbers and plug them into that formula. Let me give you another 15 seconds here. All right, I think we're good. Let's take a look at the results here. All right, most everybody got this one. Let's see, it's 125. It's mental age 10 over chronological 8. So that's what? Well, that's 1 2/8, or 1 1/4. 1.25 times 100 gives you 125. Or you could just look at the fact that her mental age is bigger than her chronological age and know that what? The answer's got to be more than 100. Okay, and there we go. If I give you one of these, which I love to do on the test, you're not going to be allowed to pull out a calculator, a cell phone, or anything. You're going to need to be able to plug in the numbers. Again, mental age over chronological age. Take that and multiply it by 100. Any questions on that at all? Seems to make sense to most of you. Good. All right. Let's look at contemporary IQ tests then. We're going to focus in on these Wechsler tests that I referred to earlier. And because we got mostly folks who would be taking the WAIS, we'll talk about the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is used with folks like you guys. People who are age 16 and older, goes up into the 70s and 80s. There are parallel versions that can be used with younger kids. So there's something called the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which goes up to about age 16. There's something called the WIPSI, the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, which I think extends all the way down to like age 3 or something like that. What we have here is broad-based testing that includes both verbal and performance subscales. So there are verbal subtests that we'll look at that, well, require words, right? That's what verbal would suggest. And then there are some performance subtests, right, where you're going to have to do something. Somebody mentioned earlier about, solving a puzzle. Something like that might be part of a broad-based assessment of intelligence. Well, ultimately what these various subtests look like, or yield, I'm sorry, we'll look at what they look like in a second, is 3 scores. We get a verbal IQ score. That's obviously from the verbal subtest. We get a performance IQ score, which is obviously from the performance subtest, and then an overall summary score, the full scale IQ score. Okay, this is our summary measure. So if somebody says to you, I have an IQ of 108, okay, they're really talking about that full scale IQ score. What we do now is base these IQ score calculations on the normal curve, which again is going to be based on, number 1, standardizations, that is treating everybody exactly the same way, and it's going to be based on comparing you one more time to those same age peers. Okay, so these 2 elements here are really the building blocks for being able to base these IQ score computations on the normal curve. And by the normal curve, I mean the bell-shaped curve that you guys have probably heard about somewhere along the line in terms of your academic career. So the normal curve for IQ testing looks like this, where these IQ tests have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So let me type that right on the screen for you here. The mean is 100, that's the average score, and they have a standard deviation. That's just the average difference from the mean of 15. And once we know that, we can know a ton about an individual score. Okay? So let's look at this here. What we have on the x-axis here is the scores. Here's your mean of 100. Here's 1 standard deviation above the mean, 115. 2 standard deviations above the mean, 130. 3 standard deviations above the mean, 145. And then on the left side of the distribution, what do we have? 1 standard deviation below the mean, 85. 2 standard deviations below the mean, 70. And 3 standard deviations below the mean, 55. Okay, about 2/3, it's about 68% of people score within 15 points above or below 100. That means 68%, if we were being specific here, right? 68% are between what? What 2 scores? Tell them in the chat box. 1 standard deviation below the mean, 85. 1 standard deviation above the mean, 115. Second box over here says about 95% of all people fall within 30 points of 100. Well, if we do the math here, that means almost everybody, right? 95% are between what? Are between 70 and 130. Okay? Basically, if you ask me today, to guess your IQ score, the most conservative guess I could give you is to say your score is almost certainly between 70 and 130. Okay, the likelihood of it being lower than 70 is less than 2%. The likelihood of it being more than 130 is also less than 2%. Okay, and then if we wanted to get really fancy, we could actually start talking about percentiles, and this is more than you guys need to know, but let's say you have a score of 115. Okay, this is my IQ score as tested today. Well, we know that 115 is one standard deviation above the mean. Okay, well that's pretty cool. Let's talk about that. Well, that means that I'm at a percentile rank of what? Well, if we do the math here, there's 50% of the population below 100, right? There's another 34% of the population between 100 and 115. This means that my score of 115 over here puts me at what percentile? Anybody know? Doing the math there? This puts me at the 84th percentile. And basically that means that I'm scoring at or above a level with a score of 115 of 84% of the population. Basically about 1 person in 6 scores higher than 115. That's about 16% of the population, right? So I'm scoring at or better than the scores of 84% of the people in the country here, let's say. Okay, you're not going to need to compute percentiles like that, but I do want you to know these ideas about what percentage of the population falls in these different ranges, right? About 2/3 between 85 and 115, and then almost everybody between 70 and 130. Scores lower than 70 are extremely rare. Likewise, scores higher than 130 are extremely rare. Okay? Again, the way that we do this and the reason we can plot you onto this normal curve is because of what we talked about back here on this slide, right? Because we followed standardized, uniform testing procedures, when I compare you to those same age peers, it's really easy to plot this out on this normal curve. Okay? Questions, confusion about any of that? Let me stop there for a second. Sure, I can bounce back to that one for a second. And I can put that one back up at the end. I know there's a lot of words and I bounced through that pretty quickly. But basically, what I'm trying to show you here is that the Wechsler tests have a broad range of items when they're assessing intelligence. So you'd be hard-pressed to argue, well, the Wechsler tests are unfair because they only focus in on, a couple of specific things like arithmetic skills or vocabulary. Yeah, well, it actually has both of those things, but it has both of those things plus about 9 other major subtests. Okay, so it is extremely broad-based, very much in the spirit of what Binet did originally, right? Rather than have this be a math test or a vocabulary test masquerading as an intelligence test, no, these tests are so broad-based, and we'll look at some sample items in a minute here, that you'd be hard-pressed to say, well, this isn't fair because it's only asking me these kinds of questions. It's asking you a ton of different kinds of questions. So let's look at some of those sample items here with this slide. So here are some of the verbal subtests up above the line. Let me drop a black line across here to split this slide into 2 parts here. The verbal subtests up here include general information, right? What day of the year is Independence Day? Who is Abraham Lincoln? Different things like that. Similarities. In what way are wool and cotton alike? You're going to get either 2 points, 1 point, or 0 points. You might say, they're both materials that can be used to make clothing. Great, that's a 2-point answer. You might say, both of those words have 2 O's in them. That might be 1 point, rather than 2 points. Arithmetic reasoning. Some of these are timed. The more quickly you get done the item, correctly, obviously, the more points you get. If eggs cost 60 cents a dozen, what does 1 egg cost? So we don't give you a piece of paper with a bunch of math problems. We actually do the arithmetic verbally. So you've got to know 60 cents. You got to know a dozen is 12. You got to be able to divide 60 by 12 and come up with 5 cents. And again, the more quickly you do that, the more points you're going to get. Tell me the meaning of corrupt. So there's a vocabulary section. There's a comprehension section, right? This is sort of logical reasoning. Why do people buy fire insurance? Why do we need to put a stamp on a letter? Okay. And then we've actually got a memory section. Digit span. Tell me in the chat box. How many items should the average person be able to do here for digit span, given what we know about the capacity of short-term memory? Somewhere between 5 and 9. Yeah, absolutely. So we go with digit span. Down the bottom, performance. Now we're going to have to do something. This is not just verbal. I'm going to show you a picture with an important part missing. So I show you this picture here. What's missing? And again, the more quickly you respond, the more points you get. What's missing there in the calendar? We don't know what month it is. Luis gets 8 million points on the IQ test today. Picture arrangement. We got to put these 4 pictures here together in a sequence so that they tell a story. So what should happen first here? Well, let's see if we can do this together. I guess first is he's going to walk outside. We'll make that number 1 down below. Then what's he going to do? Which one should be number 2? If we're telling a story here. Rolling the snow, I guess this would be 2. This is tough for kids from San Diego, right? Talk about bias. I guess this would be number 3. I was an East Coast kid, so I got this. I understand this. I've been in snowstorms and blizzards. There we go. Block design. Using the 4 blocks, make one that looks like this design here. So the blocks are red on one side, white on the other side, and half red and half white on the remaining 4 sides. Cool. Do that. Object assembly, putting a puzzle together. This is a dog. Put the pieces together. Digit symbol. This is speed of processing. We're given 2 minutes to work left to right. So uniform testing procedures, right? Left to right, you have to write in the correct symbol above each number. So I got to write in, whoops, I'm writing with white. That's not going to work well on white. So I got to write in here a triangle. This has got to be a diamond. That's got to be an X. Number 2 is going to be a circle, back to a triangle. 3 is a parallelogram, and so on. Okay, got to work left to right. And again, I'm going to be compared to same age peers. So if your grandfather has taken this and he moves a little more slowly, don't worry. He's going to be compared to other 75-year-olds. He's not going to be compared to a 20-year-old in terms of computing his IQ score. All right? Any questions or reactions to that? Looks pretty broad, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things here. It's not just about math. It's not just about vocabulary. It's not just about nonverbal reasoning. It's a whole bunch of different things here. Again, comprised of both these verbal subtests on the upper left and then the performance subtest beginning on the lower left and continuing on the right side of the slide as well. Okay? Questions, comments, any reactions to those IQ test items? Is that sort of what you would expect an IQ test to involve? Lots of different things. Vocab, memory, speed of processing, problem solving, storytelling, puzzles, all that kind of stuff. All right, cool. Well, let's go to our final segment today where we want to take a look at, as I told you guys back here on the title side, the nature versus nurture issue. So we've talked about how psychological assessment is more formal. It's got these rigorous procedures. We've looked at some IQ testing both historically and in terms of contemporary approaches to IQ testing. Now we want to talk about nature versus nurture. And the question I want to frame for you at the top here is one where we ask, is intelligence determined by genes or environment? Okay, do we think it's genes or do we think it's environment? This is the nature versus nurture, nativism versus empiricism debate that we framed back on day 1 of the class. Okay. To talk about this in a relatively sophisticated way, we need some terminology. So let's talk about some terminology first. We're going to talk about genotype, phenotype, twin studies, and adoption studies. So let's take a look here. Genotype. The genotype in terms of these twin and adoption studies refers to your actual genetic makeup. Okay, when we learn about this in high school, right, we learn dominant and recessive genes, and we learn about eye color, right? You remember learning this, big B, big B, 2 little b's. You guys remember that? Does that sound familiar? Talking about genotype, right, your actual genetic makeup. Okay, what's phenotype then? In your own words in the chat box, tell me what phenotype is. Phenotype refers to what? How many biology people do we have here? Your physical appearance, your characteristics. It's the observable traits given rise to by the underlying genotype. So if we're using this to refer to eye color, right, your genotype, this is 2 dominant brown eye genes, you're going to have brown eyes. If big B is dominant brown eyes, you're going to have brown eyes there, you're going to have brown eyes there. What's the only way to get blue eyes? Recessive genes like these little b's. So the phenotype would be the observable characteristics. Okay, observable characteristics. Tell me in the chat box, what is that going to be when we're talking about intelligence testing? What's phenotypic intelligence? How do we try to make intelligence observable? We're going to look at IQ scores, right? So IQ scores would be the way to talk about phenotypic intelligence, right? We're going to sort of indirectly assess this unobservable characteristic by asking you a bunch of questions like we just looked at from the Wechsler IQ test, okay? Now, if we want to try to disentangle genetic versus environmental contributions to intelligence, there are 2 major approaches in terms of our research strategies that will help us. One is called twin studies, and the other is called adoption studies. I want you to understand the logic of these as much as anything. It's not as important that you memorize specific numbers from the results of these studies, but let's think about the logic here. Well, twin studies are predicated on the fact that we have 2 different types of twins. We have monozygotic twins. What are they also known as in layperson's terms? Nobody walks through the mall talking about monozygotic twins. They're identical. They share 100% of their genes. What are dizygotic twins down below here? What do we call them? Not identical, but fraternal, right? Fraternal, I'm trying to type. They share 50% of their genes. They're actually no more related to each other, dizygotic twins, than are any other pair of siblings, okay? So we've got identical twins who share all their genes, fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes. If you were a mad scientist and you were allowed to run a twin study that you're in charge of, any way that you want to, tell me something that you would like to do here with these sets of twins. And I'll even help you and say, especially with these identical twins, to disentangle genetic versus environmental effects on intelligence. What would you want to do with a whole bunch of identical twins? Let's say I give you 40 pairs of identical twins, and you're allowed to do anything you want. There are no ethical constraints on you. What are you going to do to help tease apart genes versus intelligence, genes versus environment with respect to intelligence? Okay, we could look at their IQ scores, Catherine, I like that. Do you want to do something with them first? I love it. Marina says, put them in separate environments. Let's split them up. Think about it logically here for a second. Think about the reasoning here and sort of the logic of these twin studies. If we take these people, monozygotic twins, who are 100% the same genetically, and put them in completely different environments, as Luis is saying, right? We can dial the genes up to 100%, and we can dial the environment down to what? Well, we can dial it down to 0, basically, okay? Well, it turns out that these kinds of studies have actually been done, not because of manipulation by researchers, but because sometimes MZ twins do get separated. I'll give you a number here. Identical twins who are reared apart, MZ apart, I'm going to type in equals positive 0.75. What does that mean? What's positive 0.75? This is the correlation coefficient that we find between pairs of identical twins who are reared apart. They share all of their genes. They share none of their environment. How big is that correlation coefficient? Positive 0.75. It's pretty big, right? What's the biggest it can get to be? Positive 1.0. So what does this mean? This is the single data point. If you said you've got 10 seconds with me here in this elevator before the doors open to convince me that genes matter for intelligence, I'd say here's the one data point. Identical twins who are reared apart have a correlation coefficient of positive 0.75 for their IQ scores. Okay? What does that mean? It means that genes matter for intelligence. There's no doubt about that. Now, let me ask you this. Does this number here, positive 0.75, leave any wiggle room for environment to exert an influence? Yes or no? Is there room for environment to do something here? Yes, there is. Because if this was totally genetically driven, tell me this, what would this correlation coefficient be? If intelligence was entirely genetically driven, that would be positive 1.0. So there is wiggle room. Okay? There is room for environment to exert its influence. Okay? So we're going to talk about twin studies and adoption studies and look at evidence from them that show that either genes or environment matter or contribute to intelligence. Let's talk briefly about the logic of adoption studies, and then we'll look at some actual data points and some graphs right from your textbook. Adoption studies involve this. Adoption studies involve looking at a bio mom, if I can type, I'll be in good shape, and an adoptive mom and their child, and we basically look at the degree to which this child resembles, in terms of IQ test scores, the bio mom and the adoptive mom. Right? The logic here is this. If intelligence was entirely genetically driven, what would the correlation coefficient be between this child's IQ score and that child's adoptive mom's IQ score? If this was entirely genetically driven, what would be the connection between this child and his or her adoptive mom? Would there be any association at all? Correct, it would be 0. Right? Why? Because she gave him nothing, if it's a boy child here, in terms of the genetics. The only thing that she gives him is environment. So the logic here is basically if we find any connection between child and adoptive mom, if I draw a little circle here as best I can around this connection, if we find any correlation coefficient here, does that connection have to do with genes or does that connection have to do with environment? Tell me in the chat box. What's the logic here? Any connection between child and adoptive mom has got to be about environment. I'll give you a number for that. That correlation coefficient, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is positive 0.16. Admittedly, it's not a really, really big number. It's not like the positive 0.75 number up above for identical twins reared apart. But it's something bigger than 0, and it is, in fact, statistically significant. So that little piece there says environment matters. So if you wanted to connect these data points up with the question frames at the top, this piece, MZ apart positive 0.75, argues that genes matter, and the second piece, child and adoptive mom at positive 1.6, says environment matters. You can guess, right? The take-home message here is going to be what? That both genes and environment matter. It's not either or, it's both and. Okay. What I want to do is separate out the evidence on the next 2 slides between evidence that genes matter and then a slide that shows evidence that environment matters. Let's look at this one. Data from twin studies, and I'm going to focus here on evidence that genes matter for intelligence. Okay. And I'm going to give you 3 pieces of evidence. Okay. 3 pieces. First piece I've already given you, and that is the correlation coefficient here for identical twins reared apart. Okay? We said that this correlation coefficient is positive 0.75. Why does that suggest that genes matter for intelligence? Because they share what? 100% of their genes, and they share how much of their environment? They share 0% of their environment. 0%. Okay, so here I'm going to be talking about genes, and down here I'm going to be talking about environment. Okay, look at each of these bars. So identical reared together, all of the genes, reared together, all of the environment. Fraternal twins reared together, 50% of the genes, reared together, 100% of the environment. Siblings reared together, 50% of the genes, How much of the environment? They're reared together, 100% of the environment. Unrelated individuals reared together, 0% of the genes, reared together, 100% of the environment. And then siblings reared apart, 50% of the genes, reared apart, 0% of the environment. Okay. Could there be other factors? Well, what are you thinking about that could affect this? Give me some suggestions. So piece of evidence number 1 here, that genes matter for intelligence, is simply this number right here. Second piece of evidence to show that genes matter for intelligence is if we compare column number 1 here and column number 3 here. The correlation coefficient here in column number 1 for identical twins reared together is positive 0.86. For fraternal twins reared together, that number is positive 0.60. Okay? So there is a significant drop in the similarity of your IQ scores when we move from being identical, 100% the same genetically, to 50% the same genetically. The amount of environment that they're sharing is exactly the same. These guys share all the environment, they share all the environment. What's the only difference between bar number 1 here and bar number 3 here? What's the only difference? Yeah, and how long they live together would matter, how quickly. The only difference between 1 and 3 is the genes. It goes from 100% to 50%. So that's piece of evidence number 2, that genes matter for intelligence. So this would be piece of evidence number 1. This comparison between bar number 1 and bar number 3 is piece of evidence number 2. And then the third and final piece is just the general progression here as we move across the slide. What is the general progression with the size of the bars in the bar chart? Do they get bigger or smaller as we go from left to right? It gets smaller. The correlation coefficient gets smaller. What's happening down here in terms of your genetic similarity? As you become less and less similar genetically, you become less and less similar in terms of IQ scores. Okay? So as you become less similar genetically, you become less similar in IQ scores. Okay, that would be the third piece of evidence here that says that genes matter. Okay, so we got 3 pieces of evidence showing that genes matter for IQ. Number 1 is identical twins reared apart look really, really similar, positive 0.75. Okay. Second piece of evidence, when we compare identical together to fraternal together, the identical together are a lot more similar. The only difference is their degree of genetic relatedness. So the more genetically similar you are, the more similar you are in IQ scores. And then the third piece of evidence is as you become less genetically similar, you become less similar in terms of your IQ scores, this phenotypic IQ. Okay? Oh gosh, that's a lot of info, right? Let's stop there for a second. Any questions or confusion about what we've got depicted on the slide here? So clearly, 3 pieces of evidence are available to us to show that genes matter for intelligence. Okay, so anybody who says that genes don't matter for intelligence, they just don't know what they're talking about or they're lying. Okay? Is this the only thing that matters? No. Environment matters, and I've got a slide to show you that. Evidence for environmental contributions to intelligence. So I'm going to again do 3 pieces of evidence here. Let's talk about 3 things that we know from research that show that environment matter for intelligence. Number 1, we've already mentioned this, the correlation between the IQ scores of a child and his or her adoptive mom should be 0 if it was totally genetically driven. It's not 0. It's not gigantic, but a correlation of positive 0.16 in this case is statistically significant. Okay? So that's the first piece. That's number 1 here for why we know environment contributes to intelligence. So this is again all about environmental contributions. Piece of evidence number 2. An impoverished environment leads to a negative correlation between IQ and age. Oh gosh, I got to remember what a negative correlation means. As your age goes up, living in an impoverished environment, it has a negative impact. It has a deleterious effect on your IQ score. The longer you live in a place that sucks for maximizing your IQ score, the worse your IQ gets over time. Think about that. The longer you're in a bad environment, the more that bad environment sucks your score down. If this was genetically driven, this intelligence thing, it wouldn't matter how long you were in that bad environment for maximizing your intelligence scores, right? It would be genetically dictated and you would just get what you would get. No. It turns out that environment matters. Okay? And environment matters because the longer you're there, the more it pulls you down. Finally, we know that an enriched environment can lead to an increase in IQ scores. James Flynn identified this amazing effect called the Flynn effect, this amazing phenomenon where there is a gradual creep up in IQ scores, population-wide, of 3 IQ points every 10 years. This doesn't mean that you individually become 10 points smarter or 3 points smarter every 10 years. It means population-wide. If we plotted out IQ scores over time, like we've done in this graphic here, there is a gradual rising average intelligence test performance over time. That is, people today, on average, are brighter than people were 50 or 100 or 150 years ago. Okay? Well, okay, I get that, but what does this have to do with an environment? Well, it's an enriched environment because if you contrast your growing up with the growing up of your parents versus your grandparents versus your great-grandparents, tell me in the chat box, and don't just say technology. In what ways was your environment enriched for maximizing your intellectual capacities? What was better for you guys than it was for your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents? Okay, so access to education. What else is better today than 50 or 100 years ago? Besides technology and the internet, what else? Because I don't think the internet necessarily makes you smarter all the time. Better nutrition. Okay, better access to health care. Even things like family size. Okay, let me ask you this real quick without getting too personal. How many siblings did your grandparents have? I could tell you that my maternal grandmother was one of like 11 kids. Okay, tell me in the chat box. We got 13, 9, 13. Okay, let me ask you this. How many kids are in your family? I'm one of 5. And now I have 3 kids. Look at that. So smaller family size. Can that represent potentially an enriched environment? Well, yeah. I mean, I can help, my wife and I can help 3 boys with their homework at home. If we had 12 boys or 12 kids to take care of and help them with their homework each night, it's not going to happen, right? So it's a very different environment. This Flynn effect is a really fascinating phenomenon, and you could point to a whole bunch of environmental factors that sort of push us towards being brighter than we were 50 or 100 or 150 years ago. Okay. There's a great book about this, by the way, by a man named Steven Johnson. It's called, I'll type it down on the lower left side here, it's called Everything Bad is Good for You. It's a fascinating book. This guy's an awesome writer. I've read about 6 of his books. And basically he makes the argument that the demands of contemporary life are probably what drives something like the Flynn effect. That is, like, if you think about TV shows now and how complicated the plot lines are in popular TV shows. He was referring to things like the TV show 24 or The Sopranos or other TV shows that you might be interested in. They're a lot more complicated than TV shows were 30 or 40 years ago. When I was a kid growing up, there was a show called Starsky and Hutch. You know, it was a cop show, and there was a bad guy, and at the beginning of the show, he did something bad, and then during the show, the cops tried to get the bad guy, and at the end, they got the bad guy. And there weren't these complicated plot lines like you'll have in 24 or in Lost or in The Blacklist or any complicated show like that, right? Like Downton Abbey or whatever, where you got to juggle all these different things at once. So those would be some other reasons why these enriched environments are resulting in this gradual creep up in IQ scores, about 3 points every 10 years or so. Okay? Questions on that at all? Does that make sense? Okay, here's what we're going to do. On Thursday at the beginning, I've got one final slide that tries to help you pull together genes and environment. It's called the reaction range. We're going to talk about this thing called the reaction range at the beginning on Thursday. And then I've got 2 clicker questions lined up for you to wrap up this intelligence section. So we'll probably do about 15 minutes max on the end of intelligence, at which point we'll transition over into development, and we'll spend 2 full days on development. It's the only chapter in part 3 of the course here where we spend 2 days. So we'll do development Thursday and then again next Tuesday. The following Thursday, 1 day, 1 session face-to-face on emotion, stress, and health. And then 2 weeks from today, you're going to have a recording for personality, which if you're really eager to get at it, is already on Blackboard. There's a little button on Blackboard that says Personality Lecture MP4. You can either view the MP4 or I've actually tossed in a link to where I pushed it up into YouTube. And that will be the final segment before Test 3, which, believe it or not, is only 16 days away. Okay? Final questions for today regarding intelligence. That's everything I've got. Online office hours today from 11 to 12. Any questions about tests? If you've got missing scores or you want to review your test, remember, email the TAs, not me, about those issues. I'll see you guys Thursday at 8, all right? Have a good rest of your Tuesday. I'll see you then. Thanks, guys.